Hey guys, Lost Legacies channel welcomes you. Tonight we are not going to talk about a forgotten battle or a dusty artifact. We're going to talk about something far more dangerous, something that held the power to raise or ruin you in the blink of an eye. We're talking about the simple business card, or as they called it back then, the calling card, and the baffling labyrinthine rules that governed its every use. Imagine, if you will, that you're in the parlor of a grand London townhouse. The curtains are heavy velvet, muffling the sounds of horse-drawn carriages outside, and the air smells of polished wood and a faint wisp of coal smoke. Your hand trembles just a little as you reach into your pocket to present a small, stiff piece of paper. Because in this world, that paper is not just your name, it is your very social soul. One wrong move, one misplaced fold, and you could be banished forever from respectable society. It sounds insane, doesn't it? But for the Victorians, this was a life or death game. You probably wouldn't survive a single week. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a well-dressed gentleman, let's say. You've just arrived in London, and your first order of business is to leave cards with the local gentry. This is not a casual drop-by. It is a formal, ritualized process that signals your intent to enter their social circle. A calling card, or carte de visite, was more than just a name tag. It was a physical manifestation of your social standing, your reputation, and your intentions. Think of it as a silent conversation. The card's very existence, its pristine condition, and the way it was delivered all spoke volumes before you ever uttered a single word. It was a tangible contract, a pact that you were a person of good breeding and that you understood the unwritten rules of the game. For example, a card could never ever be left by a lady for a gentleman who was not a close relative or an old family friend. To do so would be a scandalous breach of decorum, implying a level of intimacy that was simply not acceptable. This wasn't just about manners, it was about maintaining a rigid social hierarchy. Historians still argue whether the complexity of these rules was a deliberate form of social gatekeeping, a way to keep the newly wealthy and the lower classes from climbing too fast. The sheer number of regulations was enough to trip up anyone not born into the upper echelons of society. For a society that so valued order and predictability, these cards provided a perfect system for managing who was in and who was out. The card was a key, but a key with 1,000 different notches, and you had to know exactly which one to use. Take the material of the card itself. The most respectable cards were thick, high-quality pasteboard, often with a subtle, unadorned finish. A card that was too thin, or worse, too garishly decorated could brand you as a parvenu, someone who had money but no class. This wasn't just a snobby preference, it was a way of silently communicating your pedigree. It was the Victorian equivalent of a luxury brand, only instead of a logo, the status was in the quality of the paper itself. And it wasn't just about what you were leaving. It was about what was being left in return. The exchange of cards was a two-way street. If you left your card and the other party never returned the favor, that was a clear, unambiguous signal that you were not welcome. It was a subtle but brutal form of rejection. No need for a scene, no awkward confrontation. The silence of the unreturned card was loud enough for all of London to hear. It's so quiet, isn't it? Just this little card, sitting there on a silver tray, and yet it held the power to shape your entire social reality. We think we have it hard with our online profiles and social media algorithms, but at least those give us a direct follow or unfollow. Back then, the ghosting was done with Cardstock. You could wait for weeks, hoping for a return call, only to realize you had been quietly and irrevocably excluded. The anxiety must have been unbearable. You're standing at the front door, the footman with his powdered wig and liveried uniform looking down his nose at you. It's a morning call, and the time of day is not a suggestion, it's a sacred rule. You must arrive between 2:00 p.m. and 5:00 p.m. or sometimes 3:00 p.m. to 6:00 p.m. depending on the season and the family's specific habits. Arriving too early would be a grave imperfection. Arriving too late would suggest you had more important things to do, which was a subtle but deadly insult. You pull a clean, starched card from its case. The footman takes it with an almost imperceptible flick of his wrist. He doesn't look at you, he looks at the card, his eyes scanning for any sign of a tell. Is it a man's card? A woman's? Is it a wife leaving a card for a family, or a spinster for a single woman? Each scenario had a specific protocol. For example, a man calling on a married couple would leave 2 cards, one for the wife, one for the husband. But if he was calling on an unmarried daughter, he would leave his card for her mother, never the daughter herself. That would be an act of unconscionable boldness. If he was calling on a widow, he would leave 1 card for her. And if he was a married man, his wife's card would always accompany his, even if she wasn't present. It was an elaborate dance of paper and politeness, with each step choreographed to perfection. And you had to get it right. It's so much more complicated than our modern social scripts, which are basically just send a text and hope for the best. Back then, every action had a predefined meaning. Historians still debate whether these rules were truly about respect or just a means for the upper class to occupy their time. With so much inherited wealth and so little need for productive labor, perhaps they invented these rituals to give their lives meaning. It certainly kept everyone busy. There was always a round of calls to make, a social calendar to manage, a slate to decipher. It was a full-time job being a member of polite society, and the calling card was your primary tool of the trade. The sheer level of detail is staggering. Consider a man calling on a lady who was not at home, a concept we'll get to in a moment. He would leave his card with the servant. But if he was calling on a man, he might simply leave his card in the hall on a silver tray. No servant required. A simple difference, but one that could mark you as a novice or a master of the game. The most shocking part is that this wasn't a universal rulebook, but a set of customs that could vary slightly from one house to another, or from one social circle to another. You had to have a deep, intuitive understanding of your own set to navigate it successfully. It was like a secret code you were expected to know without ever being taught. Imagine a world where all the social rules are unspoken and a single mistake could lead to ostracization. A simple morning call, which we might think of as a casual visit, was anything but. It was a formal inspection, a ritualized presentation of your bona fides. You had to be impeccably dressed, your carriage spotless, and your demeanor serene, even if your stomach was tied in knots. You see, the morning call wasn't just about dropping off a card. It was about seeing and being seen, and it was a test of your status. The quality of your carriage, the number of footmen you brought, the livery they wore, all of it was a visual representation of your wealth and standing. A gentleman on foot was a man of lesser means, while a gentleman arriving in a fine carriage was clearly a person of consequence. And all of this was telegraphed to the hostess and her staff before you even stepped a foot in the door. A casual visitor? Not a chance. This was a social audit, and your calling card was the first page of the ledger. So you've mastered the morning call, but now you have to face the next challenge, the at-home day. Every respectable hostess in Victorian society designated a specific day of the week, let's say Tuesday, as her official at-home day. This was a weekly reception where she was formally available to receive visitors. You didn't just show up any old time. You showed up on Tuesday, and only on Tuesday, to pay your respects. It was a meticulously planned social event designed to streamline the chaotic business of social visits. Instead of people dropping by at random, they knew exactly when and where to find you. And this wasn't a party with invitations. It was an open house for anyone who was already within your social circle or who was attempting to gain entry. When you arrived, you wouldn't necessarily see the hostess. You would likely be greeted by a servant who again would take your card. This was the moment of truth. If the servant returned with a message that the hostess was not at home, it was not a lie. It was a polite social fiction, a subtle way of saying that she was not available to receive you at that moment. Perhaps she was having a bad hair day, or perhaps she simply wasn't interested in your company. The hostess had the right to accept or decline a call without giving any explicit reason. It was an unspoken code of conduct. The most interesting part, perhaps, is that this custom created an entire social infrastructure. Hostesses had to have a mental or perhaps a literal list of who was and wasn't on their approved list. This was a subtle but powerful way to control who you associated with. Historians still argue whether the at-home day was a convenience for the hostess or a power play to assert her control over her social sphere. It was both, of course. It allowed her to manage her time efficiently, but it also placed her in the position of being a gatekeeper. Your calling card, handed to a servant on a silver tray, was the key to that gate. The servant would present the cards to the hostess, who would then decide whether to grant you an audience. If she accepted your card and welcomed you in, congratulations, you had passed the test. If she sent a message that she was not at home, you were politely but firmly rejected. It was a silent judgment, a verdict delivered without a single harsh word. The sheer volume of these calls must have been staggering. Imagine a well-connected London hostess on her at-home day. A steady stream of carriages would pull up to her door, each depositing a new caller with a new stack of cards. The servants would have to be incredibly organized, keeping track of who had called, who had been received, and who had been turned away. It was a well-oiled machine of social interaction. And a fascinating tidbit is that the hostess's visiting card, which she would use when she herself made calls, often had her at-home day printed in the corner, a subtle but essential piece of information. A card from Mrs. Featherington that read Tuesdays was a clear instruction, a direct link to her social calendar. This ritual of the at-home day also highlights the difference between a formal call and a friendly visit. A morning call on an at-home day was a structured, brief interaction. You might stay for no more than 15 or 20 minutes, making polite conversation before excusing yourself to move on to the next house. The purpose wasn't to linger. It was to show that you were part of the same social set, that you were keeping up with your duties. It was a ritual of belonging, and your calling card was the membership badge. The system was so rigid that even if you were close friends, you would still observe the formalities. It was a way of reinforcing the social order, a quiet and elegant ballet of social performance. You were always on stage and your calling card was your prop. Now we get to the really juicy stuff, the silent language of the folded card. A pristine card handed over with no modifications meant a simple social visit. It was the standard handshake of the Victorian era. But what if you wanted to convey something more? What if you wanted to leave a subtle message that only the recipient would understand? This is where the folding came in. A small, seemingly insignificant fold on a corner of the card was a secret code, a way to communicate intention without ever having to say a word. It was the original emoji, only infinitely more subtle and fraught with meaning. For instance, a corner folded down meant something very specific. If you folded down the top left corner of the card, it indicated that the card was meant for the entire family. It was a general call, a sign of respect to everyone in the household. It saved you the trouble of leaving a separate card for the wife, the husband, and any unmarried daughters, which, as you remember, would be an absolute social minefield. The simple fold was a diplomatic solution, a way to show respect without getting bogged down in the minute details of who deserved what card. It was a mainstream historical fact, taught to every young man and woman entering society. But there was also the quirkier side of the folding. What about the top right corner? A card with the top right corner folded down was considered a personal card, meant for the host or hostess alone. This was a more intimate signal, indicating a closer relationship or a specific message. It was a way of saying, I'm here for you, rather than just, I'm here for the family. And if you wanted to be even more mysterious, you might fold the bottom left corner. This was a signal of congratulations. If you were calling to congratulate a family on, say, the birth of a child or a marriage, you would fold the bottom left corner to signal your joy. It was a quiet way of celebrating, a polite and understated gesture. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of these folds was a form of silent communication or just a fussy affectation of a society with too much time on its hands? It's likely both. It allowed people to express a range of emotions and intentions without the need for an awkward conversation. A card with a specific fold could convey sympathy, congratulations, or a simple hello without a single word being spoken. It was a masterclass in passive communication. But it was also an incredibly high-stakes game. A wrongly folded card could be a devastating mistake. Imagine folding the congratulations corner when you were meant to be expressing sympathy. It would be a social gaffe of epic proportions, a sign that you were either careless, ignorant, or just plain rude. And then there were the unwritten rules. For example, some people believe that folding the top left corner meant to be present, while others thought it meant to call. The ambiguity was part of the game. You had to be a master of the subtleties, a kind of social linguist to navigate the world of calling cards. The most fascinating thing about this is that the card itself became a kind of medium, a canvas on which you could express your social intent. The creases and folds weren't just accidental marks, they were deliberate messages, coded signals that were understood by everyone in the know. So next time you're folding a piece of paper, just remember that for the Victorians, it was a silent, powerful, and potentially terrifying act. So you've chosen your card, you've folded it just so, and you're ready to make your call. But where do you put the card before you get to the front door? You certainly can't just shove it in your pocket, crumpled and dog-eared. That would be a social crime. This is where the Quackrome card case comes in, a small yet immensely important accessory that was a symbol of a person's social standing and impeccable taste. A gentleman's card case would be made of something refined, like silver, mother of pearl, or fine leather. It was not just a holder for cards, it was a part of his public persona, an item that was meant to be seen and admired. You would carefully select your card from its case, presenting it with a flourish that was both practiced and elegant. The act of taking out the card case was part of the ritual, a silent declaration of your status and your understanding of the rules. A lady's card case was often even more elaborate. It was a fashionable accessory, often made to match her handbag or dress. They could be adorned with intricate carvings, precious gems, or delicate enamels. A woman's card case was not just functional, it was a statement piece, a tiny portable work of art that spoke volumes about her wealth and her sense of style. Historians still argue whether the importance of the card case was driven by practicality, keeping cards pristine, or by pure showmanship. It was, of course, a little bit of both. You needed a way to protect your cards, but the case itself became a new avenue for social one-upmanship. It was a subtle and sometimes not so subtle way of signaling your superior wealth and breeding. Consider the fringe tidbit that some people would have multiple card cases, one for each level of social interaction. A more modest one for making calls on lesser acquaintances, and a truly magnificent one for calling on the most important members of society. This wasn't just about having options. It was a strategic decision, a way to calibrate your social message depending on the audience. It was a level of social engineering that we can barely comprehend today. The card case was a prop in the grand theatrical production of Victorian life. It was so much more than a simple container. It was a tool of diplomacy, a signal of intent, and a silent conversation starter. The sheer attention to detail is just staggering, isn't it? The card itself, the way you folded it, and the case you carried it in, all of it was part of a single coherent message. There was no room for error. A crumpled card pulled from a pocket would be a devastating blow to your social reputation. It would signal that you were a thoughtless, careless person, someone who didn't respect the rules of the game. That one small action could undo weeks of careful planning and social maneuvering. The card case also served a practical purpose, of course. It ensured that your cards were always clean and crisp, ready for presentation. But its symbolic weight far outweighed its function. It was a tangible, physical representation of the value you placed on social ritual. It said, "I take this seriously. I am one of you." The card and its case were inseparable, two parts of a single unified performance. The next time you see a beautifully made vintage card case in a museum or an antique shop, don't just see a fancy box. See a small, portable monument to an entire era of social complexity, a time when a tiny piece of paper in its elegant container could make or break a person. Now let's talk about the unsung heroes of this whole elaborate dance, the servants, specifically the footmen. These men, in their immaculate liveries, were not just door openers and card collectors. They were the first line of defense, the gatekeepers of the social realm, and their job was far more complex than it seemed. A footman's role was to be the human firewall, an extension of the mistress's will. When you presented your card, you weren't just giving it to a person. You were giving it to a representative of the house, and that person's interpretation of the situation could determine your fate. The footman was trained to recognize a wide variety of social cues, from the quality of your carriage to the confidence of your posture. A fascinating and often overlooked tidbit is that a footman was expected to have an encyclopedic knowledge of social etiquette, often more so than the callers themselves. He had to know which cards to accept, which to decline, and how to deliver a polite refusal with the perfect amount of deference and firmness. For example, if a gentleman tried to leave a card for an unmarried daughter, the footman was expected to know the rule and politely refuse the card. He might say, "My mistress is not receiving," but the subtext was, "You have committed a social blunder, and I am here to prevent it from becoming a scandal." It's a kind of quiet, understated power, isn't it? A servant holding the keys to the social kingdom. Historians still argue whether this system was a way of reinforcing the class structure or a practical necessity for the smooth operation of high society. It's clear that it did both. It gave the upper class a way to manage their social interactions without having to deal with the messy business of face-to-face rejection. The footman was the buffer, the silent intermediary who could deliver a social blow without any direct confrontation. A mistress could simply instruct her footman to say she was not at home to a certain person, and that was that. No awkward conversation, no hurt feelings, at least not in public. The footman's uniform itself was a signal. The color of the livery, the number of buttons, and the presence of a crest all spoke to the social standing of the family they served. A well-turned-out footman was a walking advertisement for his employer's wealth and good taste. So when you approached a front door, you weren't just being judged by the mistress of the house. You were being judged by her entire household, from the footman who took your card to the maid who polished the silver tray. Every person in that house was part of a single unified social machine. The social call was a public performance, and every part of the machine had a role to play. The footman was the stage manager, ensuring that the show went on without a hitch. He was the one who could spot a social climber at 100 paces, the one who could decipher the subtle signals of a folded card, and the one who could deliver a message with the perfect degree of politeness. His role was crucial, but it was also invisible. He was a silent sentinel, a guardian of the gate, and his knowledge of the rules was the most valuable asset he possessed. Now that you've managed to get your card past the footman, what's next? The card's journey isn't over. It's now in the hands of the hostess, and it's about to fulfill its most important purpose, to be used for introductions and connections. In an era without social media or widespread telephones, the calling card was the primary tool for building and maintaining a social network. It was the original friend request, and its acceptance was the equivalent of a follow-back. The card was your passport into a new social circle. For example, if you wanted to meet someone important, say a powerful duke or a famous artist, you couldn't just walk up and introduce yourself. That would be an unthinkable breach of decorum. Instead, you would need a proper introduction, and this is where calling cards came into play. An existing acquaintance would make the introduction for you by leaving your card along with their own. This was a powerful endorsement, a signal that you were a person of good standing and worthy of their time. The two cards would be left together, with the one belonging to the person making the introduction placed on top. It was a silent, visual endorsement. This was a mainstream historical fact, a cornerstone of social mobility. A particularly quirky tidbit is the use of cards to introduce people to a new city. If you were moving from the countryside to London, a well-connected friend might give you a stack of their own calling cards, along with a list of people you should call on. You would then present both your card and their card, signifying that you were a friend of a friend. It was a kind of social letter of introduction, but in a much more efficient and public form. It was a way of leveraging your existing network to gain a foothold in a new one. It was all about who you knew, and your calling card was the proof. Historians still argue whether this system was more about genuine human connection or a series of transactions and social debts. It was, of course, a blend of both. You couldn't just hand over a card and expect to be let in. The person making the introduction was putting their own reputation on the line. If you turned out to be a cad or a bore, it would reflect poorly on them. So the act of leaving a card for someone was a serious commitment, a public declaration of trust. It was a system built on reputation and trust, where a simple piece of paper could open or close 1,000 doors. The calling card was also used to manage your social obligations. If you received a card from someone, you were obligated to return the call in a timely manner. The card was a physical reminder of your social duties, a little piece of paper that said, "You owe me a visit." It was a constant cycle of giving and receiving, a social economy powered by Cardstock. And if you failed to return a card, it was a silent and powerful insult. The card was the scorekeeper, the silent arbiter of who was and wasn't in good standing. It was a system that rewarded diligence and punished neglect. The entire social fabric was woven together with these small, elegant pieces of paper. It's almost quaint, isn't it, to think of a time when a simple piece of paper held so much power. The calling card was for more than just building connections and making polite conversation. It was also an essential tool for navigating life's most somber moments. When someone died, the social obligations didn't stop. They simply changed, becoming more solemn and more specific. Leaving a card was a way of paying your respects without intruding on a family's private grief. It was a formal yet deeply respectful way of saying, "I am thinking of you." It was a mainstream historical fact that mourning had its own set of rules, and the calling card was at the center of it all. The most important rule was that the card had to be delivered in person. You couldn't just send it in the mail. That would be a gross breach of etiquette. You had to make the journey, dress in black, and present the card to the servant at the door. You didn't expect to see the bereaved family, and you certainly didn't ask to. The card itself was the message. It was a silent testament to your sorrow and your respect for the family's loss. A quirky tidbit is that the mourning card itself was often different. It might be printed on black-edged paper, a clear and unambiguous signal that this was a card for mourning. The thickness of the black border could even indicate the level of your relationship to the deceased. Historians still argue whether the complexity of these rules was a genuine reflection of Victorian emotional restraint or just another layer of social performance. It was likely a bit of both. The Victorians were obsessed with death, and their rituals were a way of bringing order and structure to something that was inherently chaotic and painful. The calling card provided a script, a set of actions that everyone knew and understood, so that no one had to navigate their grief in public. A simple card was enough to say it all. You see, the card was a buffer, a way of expressing sympathy without having to have an awkward emotional conversation. For a society that so valued emotional control, this was an ideal system. You could leave your card, and the bereaved family could see who had called on them without having to face a constant stream of visitors. It was a system that protected everyone involved. It was also a way of keeping score. A family would take note of who had and who hadn't left a mourning card. To fail to do so for a close acquaintance or a relative would be a devastating insult, a sign that you didn't care or that you had forgotten them. This wasn't just about politeness, it was about social obligation. The card was a physical record of your respect and your connection to the community. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That even in the face of death, the Victorian social machine kept on turning, and the calling card was its engine. It was a tool for life, for parties, and for death. It was a silent, powerful, and ever-present part of a person's life, from birth to the grave. The calling card was for more than just navigating social obligations and solemn rituals. It was also a powerful tool for celebrating life's milestones. When a family experienced a happy event, a birth, a marriage, or a significant honor, the calling card was the primary means of conveying congratulations. It was a formal and public way of sharing in a family's joy, a kind of pre-social media like that carried far more weight. This was a mainstream historical fact, a standard part of the social calendar. For example, when a new baby was born, friends and acquaintances would leave a card for the mother and father. This wasn't just a simple visit, it was a specific ritual. A gentleman might leave his card for the new parents, and if he was particularly close to the family, he might even fold the congratulations corner, as we discussed before. This was a quiet, respectful way of expressing his happiness for them. And for a lady, her card would be left to congratulate the mother, never the father. A quirky tidbit is that the card might be accompanied by a small gift or a bouquet of flowers, but the card itself was the most important part of the gesture. It was the official record of your good wishes. Historians still argue whether the formal nature of these congratulations was a genuine expression of joy or just another social obligation to be fulfilled. It was likely a bit of both. The Victorians were masters of emotional restraint, and the calling card provided a perfect outlet for expressing feelings without the need for a gushing, emotional display. The card did all the talking, and the person who left it could simply offer a polite nod and be on their way. It was a system that valued dignity and decorum above all else. The calling card was also used to congratulate a newly married couple. Friends and family would call on the new bride and groom, leaving their cards to officially welcome them into their new life together. This was a crucial step in the social integration of the new couple. The cards they received were a sign of their acceptance into the social circle, a physical manifestation of their new status as a family. It was a public and formal acknowledgement of their union. And let's not forget about significant honors or promotions. If a gentleman was appointed to a prestigious position or was given a title, his friends and acquaintances would leave cards to congratulate him. It was a way of saying, I see your success and I acknowledge your importance. It was a public recognition of his achievement, a quiet and elegant way of celebrating. The card was a passport, a social credential, and a tool for every major milestone, from the cradle to the grave. It's a testament to the power of a simple object to shape and define an entire society. For a gentleman in Victorian society, the calling card was an especially tricky business. While a married man's social life was often intertwined with his wife's, a bachelor had to navigate a different set of rules, one that was far more precarious and full of social traps. The bachelor's dilemma was that he had to be seen as both respectable and available, and his calling card was the primary tool for this delicate balancing act. This was a mainstream historical fact, a subtle but crucial difference in social etiquette. When a bachelor called on a family, he had to be very careful. If he was calling on a married couple, he would leave two cards, one for the husband and one for the wife. But if he was calling on a house with an unmarried daughter, he would leave his card for the mother only. To leave a card for the daughter would be a scandalous proposition, a signal that he was a rogue with dishonorable intentions. The mother was the gatekeeper, and the bachelor had to pass her inspection before he could ever hope to gain an audience with her daughter. It was an unspoken contract of respect. A quirky tidbit is that some bachelors would have different cards for different social situations. A man of means might have a more formal card for calling on the most important families and a more casual one for his friends or business acquaintances. This wasn't about being deceptive, it was about calibrating his social message. He was a master of his own public relations, using a simple piece of cardstock to convey his status and his intentions. The bachelor's card was a silent resume, a declaration of his suitability as a potential suitor or as a valuable member of a social circle. Historians still argue whether the extreme formality of the bachelor's calling card was a way of protecting young women from unwanted attention or a way of controlling and managing the marriage market. It was, of course, a little of both. The system provided a clear framework for courtship, one that was both public and private. The cards were a way of signaling intent without the need for a gushing or awkward conversation. A mother could simply look at the cards on her silver tray and know who was interested in her daughter and who was just making a friendly call. And if a bachelor was particularly clever, he could use his calling card to his advantage. He might leave a card for a prominent family, knowing that their social circles would be a valuable asset to his career. The card was a tool for social climbing, a small but powerful way to network and build a reputation. The bachelor's card was a symbol of his independence and his ambition. It was the key to his social success, and a single mistake could be a social disaster. It's a reminder that even in the most seemingly trivial of matters, the Victorians were playing a high-stakes game. As the Victorian era progressed, the calling card went through an evolution of its own, from a simple piece of handwritten paper to an engraved masterpiece. The rise of engraving technology made it possible to create intricate and beautiful designs on cards, and this new level of detail became a new way to signal wealth and status. No longer was it enough to have a simple, tasteful card. Now it had to be a work of art. This was a mainstream historical fact, a clear sign of technological progress influencing social ritual. A handwritten card, while charming, could be messy and inconsistent. An engraved card, on the other hand, was a work of precision and elegance. The letters were crisp, the design was uniform, and the quality of the engraving itself was a sign of the cardholder's taste and means. A gentleman would choose a simple but elegant font for his name and address, while a lady might choose a more decorative script. The cards themselves were often works of art, with delicate borders, embossed crests, or even small, intricate illustrations. A particularly quirky tidbit is that some people would even have a different design for their mourning cards, with a somber, understated font and a simple black border. Historians still argue whether the move to engraved cards was driven by a desire for uniformity and efficiency, or by a simple need to outdo one another. It was a bit of both, of course. The cards were a form of public relations, a small but powerful way to convey a message about yourself without having to say a word. An engraved card said, "I am a person of substance and taste. I am a part of the social elite." The cards were a physical manifestation of a person's identity, a small but powerful piece of their public persona. The technology of engraving also led to a more standardized size for calling cards, which made them easier to store and transport. The cards became more uniform, a kind of social currency that was recognized and accepted by everyone. The cards were now a form of social currency, a universal language that everyone understood. It was a move away from the personal and the quirky and toward a more standardized, regulated system. But even with the new technology, the rules of the game remained the same. You still had to know who to call on, when to call, and what to do with the card once you had it. The technology changed, but the ritual remained. The engraved card also made it easier for people to get their names out there. A person of means could simply order a new batch of cards and have them sent out to everyone they knew or wanted to know. It was a kind of mass communication, but in a much more elegant and understated form. The cards were a way of signaling your presence, your availability, and your importance. They were a small but powerful tool for building and maintaining a social network. The calling card's evolution wasn't limited to the engraving on its surface. The very size and material of the card became a signifier of status. A card wasn't just a card. It was a physical object, and its dimensions, texture, and thickness all spoke a silent language. This was a mainstream historical fact, an unspoken code that everyone in polite society understood. The card was the paper equivalent of a person's handshake, firm, confident, and leaving a lasting impression. A high-quality card was made of thick, heavy pasteboard. It was crisp, clean, and felt substantial in the hand. A flimsy, thin card, on the other hand, was an instant red flag. It was a sign that the person was either a social climber on a budget, or worse, someone who simply didn't understand the rules of the game. A person of true class and distinction would never, ever use a cheap card. A quirky tidbit is that some people would even have their cards custom made with a specific texture or a unique, subtle watermark, a kind of secret signal of their elite status. It was a level of social one-upmanship that was invisible to the uninitiated but obvious to anyone in the know. Historians still argue whether the obsession with card quality was a genuine reflection of taste or simply a form of conspicuous consumption, a way to show off your wealth without saying a word. It was probably a mix of both. The Victorians were obsessed with appearances, and every detail, no matter how small, was a potential opportunity to project an image of power and respectability. The card was a perfect example of this. It was a small, elegant object that held an immense amount of social weight. The size of the card also mattered. While there were general guidelines for the size of a gentleman's or a lady's card, a card that was too large or too small was seen as a social blunder. A card that was too big was a sign of vulgarity and a desire to stand out, while a card that was too small was seen as a sign of being timid or insignificant. The size had to be just right, a perfect balance of elegance and understated confidence. The card was a physical manifestation of a person's social standing, a tangible representation of their place in the world. Even the way the card was presented mattered. A card that was still in its plastic wrapper or, heaven forbid, had a sticky note on it would be a social disaster. The card had to be pristine, untouched, and presented with a kind of practiced grace. The entire process from the selection of the card to its final presentation was a single, coherent performance. It's a reminder that for the Victorians, social interaction was an art form, and the calling card was one of its most important tools. Like all great social rituals, the calling card's reign eventually came to an end. The very forces that brought it to its peak, industrialization and the new fast-paced rhythm of modern life, were also the forces that led to its decline. The card became a relic, a quaint artifact from a more leisurely and formal time. This was a mainstream historical fact, an example of how technological and social change can render a once essential custom completely obsolete. The advent of the telephone was the first nail in the coffin. Why take the time to travel across town and leave a card when you could simply pick up a receiver and talk to someone? The phone made communication instantaneous and personal, and it rendered the silent, ritualized language of the calling card unnecessary. The phone was a disruptive technology, a social earthquake that shook the foundations of Victorian society. It was a faster, more efficient way of doing business, and eventually, a more common way of handling social calls. The need for a physical record of a visit faded away. A quirky tidbit is that some people tried to hold on to the tradition, using calling cards to schedule phone calls or to leave a message when the line was busy. But it was a losing battle. The phone was simply too convenient, too practical, and too modern. It was a symbol of a new era, one that was less formal and more direct. The card, with its emphasis on ceremony and subtlety, felt out of place. It was a dinosaur in a world of sleek, new machines. Historians still argue whether the decline of the calling card was a loss for social etiquette or a much-needed liberation from a rigid and overly complicated system. It was likely a bit of both. The calling card provided a clear set of rules for social interaction, and its absence left a void. People had to learn how to communicate in a new way, without the benefit of a silent code or a set of established rules. It was a kind of social chaos, a messy period of transition. But it was also a liberation. People were no longer bound by the rigid rules of the card, and they were free to communicate in a more personal and informal way. The decline of the calling card also coincided with this shift in social values. The old class distinctions began to blur, and the rise of a new, more egalitarian society made the card's emphasis on hierarchy feel old-fashioned and out of touch. The card was a symbol of a bygone era, a time when social status was everything and every interaction was a performance. It was a casualty of progress, a quiet monument to a world that was rapidly fading away. The card and its elaborate rules were a last gasp of a society that was so formal, so structured, and so obsessed with appearances. You might think that the calling card is completely gone, a dusty relic of a bygone era, but if you look closely, you can see its echoes everywhere in our modern social norms. The card may be gone, but its spirit lives on in our digital and physical world. The idea of using a small object to convey a powerful message is still with us. This is a mainstream historical fact, a clear and ongoing legacy. Consider the modern business card. It's a direct descendant of the calling card, but with a different purpose. It's not about social standing, it's about professional networking. But the rules of the game are still there. You're expected to have a clean, well-designed card. You're expected to present it with a certain amount of decorum. A crumpled, dog-eared business card is still a social crime, a sign that you don't take your work or yourself seriously. The business card is a modern-day calling card, a small but powerful tool for making a connection. A quirky tidbit is the use of business cards in different cultures. In Japan, for example, the exchange of a business card, or meishi, is a highly ritualized process with its own set of rules and protocols. You must present the card with two hands. You must study the card for a moment before putting it away, and you must never, ever put it in your back pocket. It's a direct callback to the Victorian obsession with social ritual. The card is a symbol of respect, and its handling is a reflection of your character. Historians still argue whether the formality of the business card is a universal human trait or a lingering echo of the Victorian era. It's likely a bit of both. The need for a simple, efficient way to exchange information is universal, but the obsession with ritual and decorum is a direct legacy of the calling card. The card is a way of creating a physical connection in an increasingly digital world. It's a tangible record of a meeting, a small but important piece of paper that says, "We have met. We have made a connection." The calling card also lives on in our digital profiles. Your LinkedIn profile is a kind of digital calling card, a public representation of your professional self. Your social media bio is a kind of digital calling card, a short and sweet summary of who you are and what you're about. The concept of using a small, curated set of information to present yourself to the world is a direct legacy of the calling card. The card may be gone, but the idea of using a piece of paper or a digital profile to manage your public persona is still with us. The calling card was a silent, powerful, and endlessly fascinating tool for social interaction, and its legacy is all around us. And so, we come to the end of our journey, a sleepy wander through the forgotten world of Victorian social rules in a tiny piece of paper. We started in a grand London parlor, and we're ending here, with the soft hum of the fan and the gentle dim of the lights. The calling card, that small, seemingly insignificant object, was a world unto itself. It was a silent language, a social contract, and a tool for navigating the most delicate moments of a person's life, from birth to death. It was a key to 1,000 doors and a guard at 1,000 gates. Historians still argue whether the importance of the calling card was a sign of a society's deep respect for tradition or a symbol of its obsession with rigid social class. The answer, of course, is both. The card provided order and predictability in a world that was rapidly changing. It was a physical record of who you were, who you knew, and where you stood in the grand social hierarchy. It was a passport, a resume, and a social diary, all in one. A quirky tidbit is that some people would keep albums of the cards they received, a kind of social scrapbook that chronicled their entire lives. The card may seem like a fussy, silly thing to us now, but for the Victorians, it was everything. It was a quiet and elegant way of communicating in a world that was less about gushing emotion and more about decorum and restraint. It was a way of saying, "I am here. I am a person of consequence, and I respect you." A mainstream historical fact is that this entire system, this beautiful, intricate dance of paper and politeness, was a way of building and maintaining a social fabric in an era without phones or the internet. The card was the original social network. So as you drift off, let the thought of this tiny card be a reminder that even the smallest things can have the greatest meaning. The paper, the font, the fold, every detail was a silent message, a quiet part of a larger conversation. The Victorians were playing a game, and the calling card was their winning hand. It was a secret language spoken in parlors and on the steps of grand houses, a quiet ballet of social performance. It was all so very complicated and so very simple. The soft hum of the fan is a steady, gentle rhythm now. The sounds of the world outside are fading. There's only the quiet whisper of this history, a story that is no longer being told. The cards have been put away, the footmen have gone to bed, and the grand parlors are dark. The dance is over. The social machine has stopped for the night. And all that's left is a quiet moment of calm, a peaceful settling into rest. The rules are gone, the cards are gone, and the only thing left to do is to close your eyes.